coming. My name is Chris Rogbrand, the Director of Programming and Resident Musicologist here at the Moravian Music Foundation, for those of you who don't know who I am yet. I want to welcome you to the Archie K. Davis Center. This is our Winston-Salem home for our fall talk. This is part of our year-long series where we invite guest lecturers and artists to come in and speak to us about topics related to what we do here at the Music Foundation. I'm very excited about today's guest, Professor Janelle Davis, the Fabulous, her official title. I got a chance to briefly work with her before I came to the Music Foundation when I was teaching at Central Piedmont Community College down in Charlotte. So I hope you join me in a warm greeting for our special guest today, Professor Davis.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be talking about Samuel Wesley, who is one of the sons of the founders of the Methodist Church, John and Charles Wesley. While in school at Oxford in 1729, brothers John and Charles Wesley started a college holy club that stressed a disciplined Christian life in inner purity through methodical diligence, or as some at the time sought, fanatical diligence in prayer, fasting, sacraments, outreach, and the study of Scripture. The club grew into an evangelical reform movement that swept through the Anglican Church and was transplanted to the American colonies during the course of the 18th century. The movement, which came to be called Methodist, at first sought only to better Christian life within the Anglican Church, not separating from the Church of England until after the death of its co-founders, John and Charles Wesley. The Wesleyan evangelical fervor of the 18th century was part of a wider evangelical revival. During this period, the Moravian Church in England was also setting its roots, which would be led in part by James Hutton. The interactions between the Wesley brothers and Hutton proved a vital link between the Moravians and the Methodists. The first seeds between Hutton and the Wesleys were sown when Hutton, while visiting friends in Oxford, attended John and Charles Wesley's Holy Club. Hutton was deeply affected by this meeting. In 1735, the Wesley brothers were called on by General Oglethorpe, governor of Georgia, to go to the American colony of Georgia as missionaries. On their way from Oxford, they came through London, where they again made Hutton's acquaintance, staying in the Hutton family home until boarding their ship to Georgia. The ship, called the Simmons, also carried a number of Moravian missionaries en route to Georgia, and thus the Methodists and Moravians were brought together by their common interest. Hutton, who still considered himself Anglican, was engaged in an apprenticeship and did not go to Georgia. Instead, he set up a bookshop in 1736 at the Bible and Sun and founded his own evangelical religious club in his back parlor. While on the voyage to Georgia, John Wesley kept a journal. He sent copies back home to Hutton, who read them out at his weekly meetings in his parlor. These journals, John Wesley spoke of his admiration for the Moravians for their gentleness, courage, communal spirit, and evenness of temper. As James Hutton read these reports to his society at the Bible and Sun, he began to feel a keen connection with the brethren. An often retold and dramatic story is one of a violent storm at sea, during which the other passengers on the voyage to Georgia screamed with terror during this storm. The brethren, however, calmly sang hymns. This impressed John Wesley. Assured in faith, the brethren were unafraid to die, something that Wesley could not admit for himself. "How is it thou hast no faith?" he wrote in his journal. This struggle of the heart was something that would plague Wesley for the remainder of his time in the colonies. In Georgia, Wesley worked alongside the Moravian teacher, August Spangenberg, the son of a Lutheran minister who had become assistant to Nicholas Zinzendorf, founder of the renewed Moravian Church. Upon his return from Georgia to England, Wesley crossed paths with Peter Buller. Buller, who had just been ordained by Zinzendorf, was on his way to South Carolina by way of London. John Wesley and Peter Buller met in February of 1738 and spent 3 weeks together in intensive dialogue. Wesley, still comparing the matters of his heart to the faith that he witnessed of the Moravian brethren, was trying desperately to work out his own salvation. After 3 years in America, still wrestling with his faith, Fearing he had only legal religion rather than genuine faith, he wrote sadly in his journal, "I, who went to America with others, was never myself converted to God." Buller, in a letter to Zinzendorf, seems to echo this sentiment. He knew, said Buller of John Wesley, that he did not properly believe in his Savior. Wesley was racked by doubt, hoping for heart-throbbing conviction. At last, Buller entreated Wesley to preach faith until you have it, and then he set out for South Carolina. In May, Wesley went very unwillingly to a society meeting on Aldersgate Street. This was the second society founded by James Hutton, and it was there at, very specifically, about 8:45 that Wesley found his assurance. "I felt my heart strangely warmed," Wesley writes. "I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death." Though not as well documented, John's brother Charles, who taught Buller English, had a similar conversion of the heart after time spent with him. Similarly, Buller instigated growth and revival among the members of Hutton Society, which soon grew too many in number for Hutton's house and moved to a large meeting house to become the Fetter Lane Society. Leading the society now were James Hutton and Charles Wesley in a period of happy fervor together. Charles Wesley was said to sing for very joy as he walked to the Sunday evening love feast in Fetter Lane. John Wesley was just as enthusiastic, even making a pilgrimage to Marienborn and Herrnhut to visit the brethren there. But John Wesley soon found fault in the Moravian doctrines, to which he found he could not reconcile. And in conflict too detailed to sort out here, the Methodists and the Moravians parted ways. Still, the Wesleys remained close personal friends with Count Zinzendorf and several brethren friends for years to come. Going forward, the Methodist co-founders would find their leadership met at various times with harsh criticism and, on occasion, mob violence in opposition to their fervent religious movement. Their preaching was unsanctioned and threatened the traditions of the established church. Anglican leadership found the brothers overly enthusiastic at best, fanatic heretics at worst. In other circles, however, especially among the working class, great crowds gathered to hear the Wesleys preach the born-again gospel of personal faith and discipleship wherever their itinerant ministry took them throughout the British Isles. John Wesley was known far and wide for his fiery preachings at revival meetings. Charles Wesley also preached sermons, but was known better as the hymn writer and poetic muse of the Methodist Church. He is said to have often broken into song while preaching, and personally recounted how God enabled me to lift up my voice like a trumpet so that all distinctly heard me. John, writing to his brother Charles in 1766, succinctly defined their individual strengths. "I am the head, you are the heart of the work." Of the thousands of hymns that Charles Wesley penned, one of the most widely known today is "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," set by Mendelssohn to the tune "Still Heard at Christmas." In the 18th century, evangelical attitudes towards church music mirrored an ideological shift away from institutionalism and toward individualism. Religion became a matter of the heart in which the Christian entered into a personal relationship with the Creator. Salvation did not come by the authority of church or priest, but through a direct liaison with God. Music was to be a powerful expression of this direct person-to-God relationship, a role that in Germany, Martin Luther enforced by translating chants from Latin to the German vernacular in many new and simple, straightforward hymn settings that would be easy for a congregation to understand and sing. This, the Anglicans soon adopted into their psalm singing. Traditional Latin polyphony in the Church of England was replaced by new vernacular forms of worship with the Act of Uniformity of 1549. The first legal publication for English congregational worship was the prayer book from the same year, followed by several other collections, including the famous Sternhold and Hopkins settings that until the 19th century remained in use both in the Church of England as well as in the American colonies. But in actuality, in the 18th century, little congregational singing actually occurred in the Anglican services. The practice of lining out a type of response congregational singing in which a parish clerk would drone each line for the sake of those without books or for those who could not read had become slow, dull, musically unsatisfying. Even though a rich repertoire of newly composed polyphony had been developed, first by composers Thomas Tallis and Christopher Tye, and later by those like Thomas Morley and Thomas Weeks and Orlando Gibbons, hymns and services were meant for cathedral and collegiate choirs, not for congregational expression. The time was again ripe for musical reform within the church, and Methodists, whose music was characterized by robust singing, led the way. As Luther had done with his Contrafacta, Methodists' hymns superimposed sacred texts on secular tunes that were popular and by turn accessible to a mass of people. This was opposed to the Anglican use, almost exclusively of metrical psalms. Lively, hearty communal hymn singing by and for the people became a badge of Methodism. There are accounts of Charles Wesley leading congregations in singing as they walked down the road from one meeting to the next. Thomas Chatterson, writing in 1770, described a Methodist as one who could sing 100 hymn by rote, hymns which will sanctify the throat, but some indeed composed so oddly, you'd swear 'twas bawdy songs made godly. Earlier in 1704, John Scott, in his otherwise critical observations of Methodist music, had conceded that Methodists have got some of the most melodious tunes that were ever composed for church music. In point of fact, that the Methodists were a singing congregation at all owes credit in large part to the Moravians. The Moravians published hymnals in 1501, even before Luther did, and this is evidence of the important place music took in daily personal and corporate Moravian life. The kind of hymn singing the Methodists adopted from the Moravians has seeds in the Wesleys' time spent with the Brethren in America. The hymns that he heard on the ship crossing the ocean were so very unlike the stodgy psalms that were permitted and commonplace in Anglican worship. The Moravians' hymns extended beyond scriptural paraphrases and instead used texts of a personal and effective nature. The preface to a 1569 Polish edition of the Brethren's hymnal reads, "Our fathers have taught us not only to preach the doctrines of religion from the pulpit, but also to frame them in hymns. In this way, our songs become homilies." This idea translated into the Wesleyan ethos of singing what was preached and preaching what was sung. In the meantime, in 1736, upon arriving in Georgia and leaving the ship, Wesley asked to borrow the Gesangbuch, the Moravian hymnal, and he worked to translate it. Using it as a template, he published his first hymnal in Georgia in 1737 called A Collection of Psalms and Hymns. It contained 70 hymns from various sources. He adjusted them all to be in 6 basic meters, all iambic, to create singable melodies in stark imitation of the Moravian hymn style. Once established, congregational hymn singing was the only music of early Methodist meetings. There were no organs or other musical instruments because Methodist meetings and preaching services were assembled in all kinds of spaces, including barns, warehouses, inns, or in the absence of a sheltered space, simply outside. There were no organized choirs, thus no anthems to be heard, and from John Wesley's point of view, no need for them. In the 1766 minutes of the Methodist meeting, John Wesley said simply, "Exhort everyone in the congregation to sing." In the Methodist Church, there was a great suspicion of any music that approached performance, and a choir could be construed. As late as 1782, Methodist directives stated that anthems should not be sung unless on extraordinary occasions because they cannot properly be called worship. And later, can anything be done to prevent a great evil, namely bands of music and theatrical singers being brought into our chapels? 18th century Moravian attitudes about music in the church shared not attract too much attention to itself or outside performance. The use of instruments in the services was not so tightly controlled. For the Moravian Church in America, story early on We know that in 1742, Bethlehem had flutes, violins, violas da breccio, violas da gamba, and horns. For Methodists, music had a very pointed with the Protestant Reformation was less about the music and more about the text. Young has called it a lyrical theology. Through music, theological ideas and Christian principles could be ingrained and internalized by the people of faith. Music was an emotional expression when, used properly, intensified religious feeling and edified the disciplines of the Christian life. Its propensity for immoral use, however, was something of which to be wary and something of which to be in control. Moravians dealt with this too. Moravian leaders were concerned with from oversharing children. An example of this concern was in Salem in 1778. On account of so many visitors, attracted in part by the Moravian service music, the congregation decided to discontinue music for a while, and they further mitigated the issue by changing their Easter sunrise in the afternoon. Back in England, concerns about music motivated John Wesley to particular guidelines regarding which hymns could be sung. Preachers at the 1747 Methodist Conference were instructed to use only Wesley-approved hymns and services. By the time of John's death, the Wesley family had published 4 hymns for use in the Methodist. Also issued directives for the manner in which Methodist hymns were to be sung. The appendix to his Select Hymns of 1761 tells Methodists to beware of singing as if you were half dead or half asleep, but lift up your voice with strength. At the same time, he cautioned that singing should be done modestly. It was important, he said, to sing in time, do not run before or stay behind it. At the 1765 conference, Methodist preachers were also told not to sing too slowly and to teach their congregations to sing note by note and to correct any wrong singing. The Wesleys encouraged then a high standard of execution and musicality in the singing at Methodist meetings. This was the musical to which a child of Methodism, Samuel Wesley, son of writer and nephew of John the Preacher, was brought when he came into the world on Handel's birthday, February 1966, and by coincidence, also the year that Salem was founded in North Carolina. Samuel Wesley showed an early aptitude for music. According to his father's account, first published in Daines Barrington's 1781 Miscellany, Samuel played his first tunes at the age of 3 on the family harpsichord, picking out songs that he had heard from the street organ. The extraordinariness of this is tempered by his father's caveat that Samuel's prodigy did not manifest as early as his older brothers had. Charles Jr. apparently could play by ear at only 2 3/4. Even though the young talents of both Charles and Samuel caught the attention of important musicians, it is clear that their parents initially had no intention of bringing up any of their children to become professional musicians. Modern-day parents may still identify with the hope that their children might learn to choose a more stable career. It was the same in the 18th century. Charles likely imagined his sons following his footsteps in the ministry or in other learned or gentlemanly professions. Charles Jr., however, was 8 years Samuel's elder, and by the time little brother Samuel showed his prodigy, the Wesley parents were softening to the idea of their son's growing momentum toward a life in music. Like many little brothers, Samuel was the beneficiary of hand-me-downs of various, not the least of which was his second-hand music education. Samuel was 3 when Charles Jr. started taking lessons with Mr. Kelway, and Samuel reportedly loved to look over his brother's shoulder, taking, according to his father's account, great delight in hearing his brother play. At home, Charles would pass the evenings playing through Handel's oratorios, and Sam was always at his elbow, listening and joining in with his voice. By the age of 4, Samuel had taught himself to read by studying a copy of Handel's Samson, and by 5 had memorized all the recitatives and choruses of Samson and the Messiah. When he was 6, Samuel started his own lessons with the neighborhood organist, David Williams. It was around this time that Samuel started to play the violin. In his 1836 autobiographical reminiscences, Samuel remembers that he largely taught himself, although he did have some formal lessons on the violin, at first with an army musician, Mr. McBean, for about 6 weeks. 20 or so more lessons followed with William Kingsbury, in which Samuel studied Corelli's violin music, later Kramer in London before the advent of the modern torque bow, took in 1774, the composer William Boyce visited Wellesley home, famously saying to Samuel's father upon arrival, "Sir, I hear you've got an English Mozart in your house." Samuel caught the attention of other prominent aristocrats and important London musicians by way of his wealthy and well-connected godfather, Martin, also the chaplain at the Lock Hospital. Among those in Madame's circle of influence were the director of music at the Concert of Ancient Music, music historians Charles Burney and John Hawkins, along with James Nares, who directed music at the Chapel Royal. It was through Madame that Samuel met Carl Friedrich Abel, who ran the prominent Bach-Abel concert series with Johann Christian Bach, the youngest son of Johann Sebastian Bach, Lord Ellisford, Lord Dudley, Sir Watkin Wynne, the Honorable Daines Barrington, and other lovers of Handel were among those for whom Samuel played while growing up. Barrington witnessed the boy's talents firsthand and later edited and published Charles Wesley's account of his two sons, along with his own observations, in 1781. Among the topics covered are the possibility of whether the turkey was known before America, thoughts on the deluge in the time of Noah, and observations of various child prodigies, including the Wesley children, and Mozart. Barrington's book offers text for Samuel's early childhood. Samuel was given many opportunities to perform, albeit privately arranged, while his father allowed a stream of visitors to their home, and while he allowed his son to be taken around by trusted associates to various important musicians and aristocrats. Charles Wesley initially rejected any notions of public performances. The unavoidable attention of childhood celebrity caused Charles Wesley a great deal to give Samuel opportunities for his music, that the attention would interfere with spiritual development. While traveling for the ministry in 1773, Charles Wesley wrote home to Samuel, "Foolish people please you." The parade of visitors continued and even burgeoned once the Wesleys moved from their longtime home in Bristol to a house on Chesterfield Street in Marylebone on the outskirts of London. Musical life in London, Samuel's childhood and teenage in the 1770s and 1780s was. In many respects, England enjoyed a unique cultural climate and fostered a kind of voracious concert life not seen elsewhere in the rest of the continent. While devastating poverty persisted in segments of the London population, prosperous trade and manufacturing brought on by the Industrial Revolution created an increasingly wealthy upper class, as well as a burgeoning middle class, eager to patronize concerts. Unlike other major European centers, court patronage in England after the Civil War was weak, and London musical life thus became less by nobility and gradually more commercialized. A concert-going middle and upper-class public who met certain qualifications of wealth and social status could therefore patronize any number of offerings in London. Garden concerts were the most affordable and most informal place to hear music, and thus had the widest cross-section across classes. The King's Theatre hosted the wildly popular Italian opera, while the two English playhouses at Covent Garden Drury Lane employed orchestras to play concertos and instrumental music before the curtain opened and during intermissions. During Lent, oratorios were heard at the playhouses for reasonable ticket prices and were therefore attended by a fairly diverse audience. Individual musicians also put on their own concerts, usually in the form of an end-of-season benefit concert, a last money-making hurrah for themselves before the slow summer season. Private concerts were also ubiquitous and were most often operated by amateurs and enthusiasts in musical societies who played together for their own pleasure, then for profit. Aristocrats and the well-connected also gave private concerts in their homes for invited audiences. The music historian Charles Burney hosted such events. Other private concerts, like the Nobility Concert and the Ladies' Concert, rotated from house to house in certain wealthy circles. These private soirees were a separatist reaction against a growing mixed-class public at popular concerts. By keeping their events truly private, elites could keep the riffraff out. Although subscription concerts were public, they catered to the upper classes by virtue of their high ticket prices, as well as the requirement of advance payment. These events were where the latest music was heard, and concert advertisements often billed the newest foreign star. Johann Peter Salomon's subscription concert, for example, brought Haydn to London in 1791. Some subscription concerts required potential attendees to apply to a committee before being permitted to subscribe. The London public was also captivated by child prodigies. Besides the Wesley boys, two of the other prodigies Barrington featured in his miscellany were Amadeus Mozart and William Crotch. Mozart was brought to London to play a concert at Hicksford's Rooms in 1765, the year before Samuel Wesley was born. And in 1780, Crotch had a concert at the Pantheon when he was only 4 years old. The Wesleys had several good reasons to move to London, but it was perhaps the idea for the boys to start their own concert series that provided the final impetus. By the end of 1778, the Wesleys had circulated a concert proposal for the following year among their friends and family. Samuel was 12 at that first January concert in 1779, still young enough to be considered a prodigy. His older brother Charles Jr., on the other hand, was already 21, and Samuel's father was 71 years old. The concerts were held in their new house on Chesterfield Street that had, by some accounts, come already furnished with 2 organs for the boys. The concerts were given on the main floor of the house in the large drawing room that, by one estimate, was approximately 600 square feet. The Wesley family concerts followed the established London winter concert seasons and took place every other Thursday night. The cost of admission of 3 guineas for the season was roughly in line with other concerts around town, high enough to ensure a well-class and respectable audience. For Charles Wesley, this exclusivity imposed by cost was most welcome. Fearing music's propensity for immoral use, he had been careful to associate his children with only trusted musical contacts. Samuel had not given public concerts as had Mozart and Crotch, but with the new family concert, Charles Wesley finally allowed his sons to be in the musical world, although he was still very concerned that they not be of it. Charles Wesley remained suspicious throughout his life of the whole tribe of musicians, but he was far more liberal than was his brother John, or even many of his own Methodist converts. For them, music performed outside the realms of congregational edification was a slippery slope. Instrumental music, if it did not interfere with church music, could not be entirely condemned, but it still carried with it the propensity for evil. John Wesley was never entirely comfortable with his nephew's devotion to music or their family concerts. Professional musicians were not often associated with godly living, and in John's many letters to his nephews, he urged them to keep sight of their Christian roots. While Charles Wesley allowed his sons' music making, the conflict of the prominent Methodist co-founder between his desire to do right by his children's talent and the fine company he kept in doing so, and his duties to uphold the conservative Methodist values of a moral, humble, disciplined life are articulated in the memorandum, "Reasons for letting my sons have a concert at home." This Charles Wesley penned in mid-January, a couple of weeks prior to the very first family concert. Charles Wesley was certainly anticipating a Methodist backlash to the concert, and his reasons were his own proactive manifesto meant to meet any negative reaction. While the reasons express Charles Wesley's own ambivalence toward the music profession, they are balanced by his plans to guide his sons through it. While bad company and bad musicians could corrupt both his sons' good taste and good morals, Charles Wesley felt that by carefully curating the family concerts with proper music and respectable colleagues under his own roof, he could provide them safe and honorable opportunities to develop both their skill as performers and composers. In this way, Charles Wesley hoped to mitigate the risks of what he regarded as the dangerous world of the music and to balance with them with the benefits for his son. Yet, for all of his protection, Charles Wesley could not shelter his son Samuel from his own human nature. The 20th century Lebanese writer Khalil Gibran, in his poem On Children, wrote, "You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow." Samuel was independent, opinionated, and very strong-willed. As a young adult, he was in constant rebellion against his father's authority, the church's authority, and society's norms, much to the bewilderment and distress of his family. The rebellion manifests strongly during the family concerts, which ran their course during Samuel's difficult teenage years. He had some familiar troubling adolescent behaviors, drinking too much and staying out all night. It was around this time as well that Samuel started dating Charlotte Louisa Martin, a woman several years his elder, and with whom he later lived without being married. Another source of tension during the family concert was Samuel's conversion to the Roman Catholic Church. Catholic churches in which the older traditions of Gregorian music were kept alive, masses and other service music not found elsewhere in London attracted him. Samuel didn't end up being a devout Catholic any more than he had ever been an earnest Methodist. Regardless, Samuel's Catholic conversion was a great scandal for the family. It was also an embarrassment for Methodists who blamed Samuel's waywardness on music and on the handling of his prodigy, and by proxy, the family concerts. Charles Wesley, too, began to question whether he should hold course and continue with his son's musical training. In 1784, he wrote of his growing weariness with the concerts. The family concerts did continue, but without Samuel on the violin. He had lost his favorite Cremonese violin after leaving it in a cab. And anyway, by the time he was 19, his interest in playing had already waned. Finally, in 1787, Charles Wesley designated that season to be the 9th and last subscription concert. Samuel was not quite 13 when the concerts had begun in 1779. When they came to a close, he was a 21-year-old adult. With the family concerts, Samuel's compositional output had exploded. Most of Samuel Wesley's orchestral music, including symphonies and overtures, a large portion of his chamber music, and all 7 of his violin concertos date from this time in the early 1780s. Samuel's early notoriety may have carried with it the expectation that he could be propelled from prodigy to fruitful career. Instead, at the final curtain of the family concerts, Samuel withdrew almost entirely from music composition and public performance. Following his father's death, Samuel's lack of ambition about his future in music is clear, writing to his mother in 1789 that he had felt forced into music and into public life. And objectively, Samuel's direction in the music field was limited. With a system of court patronage no longer in central place in 18th century England, the new economy was a gig economy. It was a freelancer's market, untrammeled by guild restrictions, monopolies, or state control. This open system was in stark contrast with many other places on the continent, completely unregulated, and this was a large factor in the meteoric growth in England. But while London musicians no longer answered to a particular patron, they lived or died by public opinion. When it was good, it was very good, but there were no guarantees of stability or predictability of work, especially when a fickle public seemed almost most entranced by imported musicians. The situation was doubly difficult for Samuel Wesley, who, as Routley describes, was brought up in a family and evangelical culture that, while encouraging him in music, had discouraged him in fitting himself for the social life that was, in that age, music's public context. By the late 1790s, Samuel had married, and in an effort to support his new family, became active again in the London music scene. His reentry was made in fits and spurts, and his career followed an uneven arc, often interrupted by long bouts of debilitating depression. It is not uncommon to read Wesley describing himself in his letters as one hating to live and fearing to die and afraid of his own thoughts. In the midst of one of these depressions, Samuel Wesley discovered J.S. Bach and poured all of his energy into learning and promoting his music. Bach was at that time largely unknown in England, just as his father and uncle had been zealous Methodist missionaries. Samuel became a Bach missionary with a similar evangelistic fervor. He gathered with him like-minded individuals in the cause, a group of Bach fans that Wesley cheekily dubbed the Sebastian Squad. Wesley introduced Charles Burney to Bach's music. Burney had previously given a negative assessment of J.S. Bach in his General History of Music. However, he had never actually heard any of Bach's music performed. After playing the well-tempered clavier for him in his home, which required moving his own piano into Burney's apartment, Wesley was proud to count Burney as one of the Bach converts. Samuel also had hopes to bring out an edition of the Credo from Bach's B minor Mass, but he was never able to realize this venture. Bach also brought Samuel back to the violin. After a long hiatus from the instrument, he often performed the Bach sonatas for violin and harpsichord with his close friend, organist, and music publisher, Vincent Novello. Additionally, Samuel held Bach's solo sonatas and partitas in high regard, calling them a violinist's precious treasure. I want to stop talking for a minute, and I want to play just a little bit, probably for the sake of time. It was also when working with Novello that Samuel, after a long separation from the church of his youth, reconnected with the Methodist community in the 1820s. While studying the Fitzwilliam manuscript bequeathed to the University of Cambridge in 1816, Samuel happened on some pages in which Handel had set 3 of his father's hymns: Sinners Obey the Gospel Word, O Love Divine, How Sweet Thou Art, and Rejoice, the Lord is King. Hoping to capitalize monetarily, he presented the works to the Methodist Society for publication. The sales of the Handel hymns turned a reasonable profit for Samuel, who followed it up with the publication of his own successful settings of Methodist hymns. I'll play just a bit of this Handel melody to the Charles Wesley tune. Rejoice, the Lord is King. Samuel's last public performance was in September of 1837. Felix Mendelssohn was in town to give a recital at Christ Church on Newgate Street, and Samuel was in the audience. The two composers had in common a deep appreciation of J.S. Bach, and at the close of his recital, Mendelssohn invited Wesley to play. A month later, Samuel Wesley died. Writing after his death, Vincent Novello's wife, Mary, remembered Samuel as a pious Catholic, raving atheist, mad, reasonable, drunk, sober, the dread of all wives and regular families, a warm friend, a bitter foe, a blasphemer at times, a puling Methodist. Vincent remembered his colleague more compassionately. Justice to the musical powers and genius of our poor friend was neither done during his lifetime, nor has been since his death, and I am sorely afraid never will be. He really seems to have been pursued by what, for want of a better word, is called fatality, or an inexplicable web of circumstances which crushed him living and still stands in the way of either himself or his works being duly appreciated. The anonymous writer of Samuel Wesley's obituary was more hopeful. It is the prerogative of genius to look forward with a calm but assured expectation that posterity will award that meed of approval which must ever attend its bright and beautiful creations. From the classical era, many of today's violinists learn a few Mozart violin concertos, maybe a Haydn concerto, maybe an early Viotti concerto. The lack of published classical violin concertos can sometimes give the impression that they were few and far between. However, far more were written than ever published or preserved. Concerto performance was at a peak in the late 18th century England during Samuel Wesley's childhood. Driven by a public appetite for modern music and the rise of the virtuoso performer, often from abroad, musicians responded to an audience taste for showmanship and took the opportunity to flaunt their abilities on the instrument. A concerto was a personally identifying signature, almost always written by a composer for that composer's sole use. Samuel Wesley's first definitively dated concerto is his C major concerto, finished November 13th, 1779. There's evidence that through the work he was still experimenting with various challenges of composition and notation, being only 12 years old. On the title page of the second movement, Samuel Wesley writes the words, "When war's alarms," a misspelled reference to the song on which the movement is based. The full title, "When war's alarmed enticed my Willie from me," is from the short satirical play The Camp, for which Thomas Linley wrote music. The Camp satirizes British preparations during the American Revolutionary War and was premiered at Drury Lane in October of 1778. Earlier in 1778, France had entered into an alliance with the Americans, and British citizens were on high alert, fearful of an invasion. The Camp was performed 57 times between 1778 and 1779, making it the most produced dramatic piece in all of London for that season. At this very time, Samuel would have been composing his concerto in C. He likely transcribed Linley's tune by ear, perhaps after hearing it sung by Miss Walpole, the heroine of the play. I'd like to play just a little excerpt of this. I know it's without an orchestral score, but just to get a taste of that youthful Wesley. But this movement, this is a second movement of the C major concerto, just a few bars on the theme of When War's Alarmed. standardized at that time, but they were sort of changing. You know, we had a sort of an earlier bow that was very small and skinny and very light, and it maybe graduated a bit later in England to something much longer, but still with a swanbill tip with an. But bows that came after that, this is a modern bow, a tort model. You'll see how different it is. This has a concave camber, which is very different from this. What would come in between this would be what Samuel Wesley would have played. Did I not get that one in my? Did I not get that one out? There it is. Sort of hybrid, and this there's a good guess that since Samuel Wesley studied with Wilhelm Cranmer, and that all of that there was writings about how many people were using his bow, that he would have played a Cranmer model bow, which this is not quite, but it's sort of closer to that than a Baroque style bow or that modern bow I showed you a minute ago. So this is a sort of modern tort bow, which it's weighted so differently in this way. It sticks to the string. I can sustain with a very even sound. I can sustain. I can make very long romantic phrases. I can almost make it sound like, you know, I have a breath that lasts, 40 seconds. This bow is much more speech-like, and if I were to do I would let the bow naturally follow. It does this natural, what we would call a messo di voce, or a sigh at the end of it, which you can manipulate to. You can do it, you can sustain it, but it's not nearly as natural to the bow. And so when you play music that was written for this bow, when you play music that is based in text, as so much Baroque music is, you find yourself able to speak words with a Baroque bow, and just so much more easily than with a modern bow, in a way that it would be really difficult to play a Mahler symphony on one of these things. So he was in very poor health in the very end of his life, and many of these were, he was institutionalized in an asylum on many occasions. He lost an infant son. He threw himself out of a window, and he just lived a very emotionally difficult life. And so while he had many recoveries, they were always in fits and spurts, and he had very high highs and he had very low lows. And so he sort of died in peace, but also without any money at the end of it all.